Okay, time to write a paper. If you're anything like me, or really, I guess, like any physical object, if you're at rest, you'll tend to stay at rest. For example, I'm happy to have a conversation, but I'll hardly ever start one. I don't have anything against eating grapes, but I have a hard time getting them out of the fridge. And of course, I don't mind writing a paper, but I sometimes have a really hard time starting one. If we are to believe Sir Isaac Newton, the first step is often the hardest. That's why going into a writing project with a good plan can be so valuable. If you spend some time planning, you won't have to start writing from a dead stop, and you also won't have to spend a half hour staring at the cursor, wondering when those words will ever come to mind. Questioning the life choices that have brought you to this point, planning your eventual escape to a quiet island where you can make a living growing fruit and never having to write another word ever again. That is, when you spend some time pre-writing, you'll end up spending less time writing, or at least less time wishing you were writing. Planning feels like a less imposing task than writing, and so it's often an easier way to get started. Then, when you actually do start writing, rather than starting from scratch, you already know what you're going to do and you can get right to business. So in today's show, we're going to talk about a few different ways that you can plan your writing. Our goal is to help you to find a strategy for working your thoughts out before you sit down to write, so that when it does come time to face that cursor, you can do so with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing what you're about and what you're there to accomplish. And if that's your cup of chamomile, go ahead and subscribe to stay steeped in all the latest from the show. And with that, let's go. So it might not really seem like something you need a guy on the internet to tell you, but thinking a lot is a valid pre-writing strategy. In fact, it's something I do at the beginning of every writing project. If I'm really honest, thinking a lot is probably more of a pre-writing strategy, but it is where I do most of my big picture strategizing. When I'm thinking a lot, I'm narrowing down my topic, I'm imagining my audience, formulating an argument, pretending to have conversations with my sources. In short, I'm getting the big pieces in place so that I can work out the details in a later phase of pre-writing. And thinking a lot is especially nice because it's something you can do to make progress on your paper wherever you are, even when you're cooking, or driving, or showering. Closely related to thinking a lot, free writing is just writing as you're thinking. If you want to do really formal free writing, which I guess is kind of like wearing a really formal t-shirt, you'll set a timer and write for that allotted amount of time without stopping. And really, you're not supposed to stop. Even if you're just writing the same word over and over again, that's still part of free writing. Now, not only is free writing a good way to get your ideas flowing and onto the paper, but it's also one of the best lesson planning hacks in the business. But my free writing usually isn't that structured. More typically, I just sit down with a blank document and start figuring things out, working my ideas over by writing about them. There are a lot of times when I don't really know what it is that I want to say about my topic until I've spent some time writing about it. Additionally, free writing is something that I tend to do more when I'm writing poetry than when I'm writing an academic paper. When it comes to poetry, I'll have some scrap of language or some interesting image that I need to work over, because I'm not just figuring out my thoughts at that point, but I'm also figuring out how the poem will be put together. But of course, that's not to say that free writing isn't appropriate for an academic project. In fact, I had a teacher who was a big proponent of free writing, and in his class we did a series of free writing exercises throughout the term, and then at the end we reshaped and revised those pieces into a more formal essay. Really, when you use free writing as a pre-writing strategy, you're creating a lot of raw material that you can then sculpt into a paper. Instead of planning out every last detail of every last sentence, you're just getting everything out of your head and onto the paper and then throwing away the excess to create your final product. And I guess when I put it that way, free writing isn't really pre-writing at all, but it is a low pressure way to get started, so it can still help you from free falling into that blank page. Now, I'm not much of a bubbler, but I do know somebody who swears by them. If you've ever heard somebody talk about a concept map or a mind map or a web or something like that, then you know what I mean when I say bubbles. Now, the basic idea of bubbles is to visualize connections between ideas. You'll take whatever you have, sources, quotations, ideas, whatever it is, and you lay them all out and then draw lines between the ideas that are related to each other. Usually those ideas will cluster around some main themes or ideas that will then help you to organize your thoughts for a paper. The last mind map I did was for a paper about grading in technical communications classes, so obviously grading was my central bubble. Now I had done some research, so I had a virtual stack of sources that I needed to sort through. And as I found connections among those sources, I found some main themes: grading philosophies, grading contexts, and grading methods. And each of those main themes ended up serving as a main section for the paper that I eventually wrote. I think the real value of using bubbles shows up when you have a lot of information to work through at once. Now, while my natural impulse is just to think about something a lot, when it came to that paper on grading, I couldn't just do that because I wasn't totally familiar with the topic, and I was dealing with a lot of things that I didn't have an intuitive sense of. Being able to use bubbles to see what I was working with and to see how all the pieces fit together then really helped me to work out my larger paper. Of course, it also didn't hurt that my teacher that semester was a big-time bubbler. He had pointed us in the direction of an online bubbling tool and suggested that we give it a try for our paper, which I did. Full disclosure though, I spent about as much time messing around with the shapes and colors of the bubbles as I did actually figuring out my paper. So that can be a potential risk of bubbling, but if you have more restraint than I do, you should be okay. Now, as I mentioned in an earlier video, my standby pre-writing strategy is outlining. Whenever I have to write an academic paper, the first thing I do is write an outline. If free writing gives you a writing process that is more like sculpting, writing with an outline is probably more like building with a blueprint, because when you write with an outline, you not only clarify your thoughts, but you plan and organize your paper, deciding what goes where and in what order. Outlines tend to be hierarchical, showing the relationship between your main points and the claims and evidence that support them. So you could think of it something like this. If you're going to build a house, you can't just build an empty building and call it a house. If house is your thesis statement, your building also needs to have the kinds of rooms that would persuade people that it is in fact a house. But again, you can't just have empty spaces in those rooms and call them bedrooms and bathrooms and kitchens. They also have to be filled with the kinds of things that those rooms would normally have inside of them. So if you were outlining a house, you might end up with something like this. Your central argument, "this is a house," would be supported by the main claims of bedroom, kitchen, and bathroom. Each of those main claims would then be supported by the evidence of the things that normally go inside those rooms. And the same thing happens when you outline a paper. You have your main thesis statement, which is supported by your major claims, which are then in turn supported by evidence. Once you've got your outline figured out, there's really not much left to do other than write your paper. And of course, I realize that's probably easier said than done, but it's also a whole lot easier done once you've got a good outline. So in the end, there's no need to start a staring contest with that empty page in front of you. With a good pre-writing strategy, you can jumpstart the writing process and overcome the inertia that comes with starting from zero. Also, I should mention that there isn't one correct way to do pre-writing. Like we've already talked about, my pre-writing process for poetry is different from the pre-writing process for writing academic papers. You'll probably find that different writing projects call for different approaches, and you may even favor certain pre-writing strategies at different times in your life. Really, writing is just about making something that people will care about. And while people will care about the paper that you produce, they probably won't care as much about the process that produced it. So find a process that works for you and leave the worrying out of it. Of course, there are bound to be other pre-writing strategies out there. If you happen to know of one that we didn't cover today, leave it in the comments. Otherwise, let us know what's on your mind. Give us a like if we earned it, and share this video with a friend if they've earned it. And that's all there is for today, so go do something cool and tell us about it next time. Quantities.